thanks for coming to this month's workshop. Definitely some familiar faces and some new people too. This month we're going to be talking about sustainable forestry and restoration forestry. What do those terms mean? They're both kind of loaded. And for that purpose, we brought in two experts. We have local forestry consultant Danielle Lindler here to speak a little bit about sustainable forestry, what that is. And then we brought down from the Ashland Forest Restoration Project, Marty Main, who's the forester there, to speak a little bit about what restoration forestry is. This is a good opportunity to just see these different styles of forestry and how management can improve forest health in the long run, improve economics in the long run, and improve the way we relate with the forest in the long run. So without waiting anymore, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle, and thanks again for coming.
Hi. Great, thank you. Forestry in California is unique. It's not like forestry in any other part of the country or the world for that matter. And I'm going to talk about sustainability in California, and specifically California, where I've worked, Cascades and the Sierras. The coastal region, Humboldt, Mendocino, some of the principles I'm going to talk about apply, but it's a completely different ecosystem and habitat type, and so just because California is such a diverse state, I kind of had to just break it up and work with what I know. So my name is Danielle Lindler. I've been in Siskiyou County since '98. I'm a consulting forester. My husband and I own a consulting forestry company called Jefferson Resource Company that was previously Berryman and Associates. We bought it from Ron Berryman in 2002. And we employ 15 people. There's 17 of us all together, including my husband and I, and we do all aspects of forest planning, wildlife surveys, archaeology surveys. We do a lot of mapping with GIS, GPS. We do spotted owl surveys. Pretty much anything to do with trees, we deal with. So what is forestry? Forestry is the art and science of managing forests amidst a very complex world, and nowhere more than California can that complex world be true. And then the other part of the talk is sustainability. What is sustainability? There's three main tenets of sustainability. You need to deal with not only the sustainability of the environment, but the economics and social, and those are called the three pillars of sustainability. And basically what sustainability is in forestry is ensuring that we're never going to run out of trees. Just a real simple approach. And that means, we're not going to harvest more than we're growing. So this is a soils map of California, or vegetation map of California, but it kind of outlines just the diversity within the state. You can see we have the Cascade region up in the green, the Modoc Plateau in the northeast corner, the Sierra Nevada in the blue, and just how varied our state is. I've worked a bit in Oregon, but not as much as our next speaker. And the, I don't want to say simplicity because forestry is not a simple science, but just the, there's not a whole lot of variation in habitat types, which makes a lot of what you do, you can take principles and apply them across the broader landscapes, where in California, literally within a watershed, you have to change your management plan based on topography, how steep the ground is, if you're on the north side of the hill, the south side of the hill, elevational zones, etc. So a forester is someone who is educated in the science of forestry and they're engaged in forest work. And in California, we have a unique license that is called the California Registered Professional Forester's License. If you want to work in this state as a forester, you need to have this license or work under somebody that has this license. So to obtain the license, you need a minimum of 7 years. 4 years of that 7 can be substituted for education. Even knowing most of the forestry degrees take you 5 years to complete, you'll get 4 years credit, and then once you get that 4 years, you have to work 3 years under somebody with their license as an apprentice. And then you get qualified to take a state exam, where it's not multiple guess, it is essay. I had 56 pages of legal-sized paper, answering everything I could think of. And we get tested on things such as tree growth and reproduction, tree and plant physiology, hydrology and soils, tree hormones and genetics, forest ecology and botany, silviculture, which is how we harvest trees to get them to look a certain way or to manipulate the habitat. We get tested on forest policy and environmental law, not just forest law, but the Interspecies Act, the Clean Water Act, both at the federal and the state level, the Historic Preservation Act, because we deal a lot with archaeology. We get tested on entomology and pathology of forest insects, forest history, economics, road design, weather, fire, fisheries, wildlife, archaeology, and a lot of our profession deals with shuffling paper. It is permit heavy in our industry. Forestry is more than just 2x4s. There's over 5,000 products that are byproducts of forests. Everything from biomass, you can see the cogen facility where we take wood waste and create renewable energy, to some of resins and cellulose that might be in plastics, or resins that might be in anything from cosmetics to film and tape. So we know wood is a renewable resource. Renewable resources are those that can be utilized and then replenished within our lifetime. And then by law, wood is harvested sustainably in California. And I always promote wood as a building product in California because it does require less energy consumption than most other alternatives, such as steel or cement. So the timber industry in California is unique. Most of our timberlands that are industrial timberlands are owned by families. Granted, a lot of these families own vast tracts of land, but be as it may, it really influences how our timberland is managed versus like a publicly held timber company, say the Louisiana Pacifics or the Georgia Pacifics of the past that used to be in our area. They have a complete different management philosophy because of quarterly returns, etc. Whereas a family landowner, a lot of our families have owned land in this state for over 100 years. So that really emphasizes a different management scheme. Kind of a unique fact is California has more forest land than any other state in the union other than Alaska. A lot of people don't realize that California really is a forested state. And I went to Washington, D.C. About 10 years ago, and I got talking to the guy in a cab, and I explained to him I was a forester, and he's like, well, what do you guys do with palm trees? A lot of the rest of the country doesn't realize that California is such a forested environment. They think of California as, 90210 and everybody's in bikinis and convertibles. So, let me go back. There is, in California, over 8 million acres set aside in parks, wilderness areas, and special habitat of our forest land. And there's over 1,100 rules governing forestry in California. So California's forests, there's about 32 million acres of timberland in this state. And of that, only about a fifth of it is able to be harvested or is managed for harvest. A lot of our forest land is owned by small landowners. The landowner that has an acre to 20 acres. So that really influences how our forests are managed. And in this state especially, there's two schools of thought that really drive a lot of the forest conflict, in my opinion. There's the thought of conservationists, which I'm a conservationist. I believe that you can utilize a resource and manage it sustainably for the benefit of human population, while also maintaining wildlife species, water quality, and the other public trust resources that we manage. But that sometimes flies in the face of preservationists that have a completely different viewpoint, more of a misanthropic viewpoint, that people are not necessarily a part of nature, that we need to have a no-touch, flag and avoid type approach to forest management so that we can leave our forests unchanged. And this is a favorite quote of my viewpoint on conservationists versus preservationists from Professor Emeritus at UC Berkeley, Dr. Bill Libby. He's a great guy, but basically I'll read it out loud. It says, conservation means using resources well and responsibly. Preservation means you're rich enough to set aside things and buy them from someone else. And what I mean by that is, in this state, we use a 32-inch tree that's 100 foot tall for every man, woman, and child. Yet we import 80% of our wood products into this state. So there's kind of a little bit of a dichotomy there, especially given our vast land base. So there's a movement in California called the California Grown Movement, which really does promote the whole think globally, act locally, but not only for food, but for forests as well. You know, I've always said that why harvest forests in other countries, because, you know, we harvest in Indonesia, Siberia, New Zealand, and then import those resources here, where we could harvest timber in our backyard, make sure it's done properly. We have trained professionals to oversee the whole process. We've got some of the best growing environment in the world. And then we're also providing jobs to our local economy. So that quote from Dr. Gillis is one that I really advocate. So that's my whole social side of the sustainability argument. So real quick, the forest practice rules in California have sustainability built into them. The second bullet point says that we need to achieve the maximum sustained production of high quality timber products. You cannot harvest in California unless you can demonstrate that you are doing it sustainably. We also have to evaluate through a cumulative impact assessment issues such as recreation, water quality, fisheries, aesthetics, etc. And then the forest practices are overseen by a board of forestry, and then CAL FIRE is the lead agency. And it's a heavily permitted process. Permits in other states such as Oregon or Washington, from the last I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the last I heard it was like a week to 2 weeks from when you decided to harvest to when you could harvest in those states.
Unless you get a waiver.
Unless you get a waiver.
Then you can do it quicker.
Okay, in California, now contrast that with California. If I want to go out and harvest my land, and I am in Siskiyou County, and I am a private landowner, and it doesn't matter if you have 5 acres or you have 1,000,000 acres, you have to, before you can harvest, you have to hire a licensed forester like myself to go out and do a timber harvest plan, which is a functional equivalent of an environmental impact report under CEQA. I would go out and evaluate your trees, your soils, your archaeology. I would have to do wildlife surveys, including spotted owl surveys, for 2 years prior to harvesting. You need to have site visits 6 times per year for 2 years prior to harvesting, and then each year you are harvesting. And it's not only within your property, but you need to survey within 1.3 miles of your project area. So, and it's about $35 a station per visit. It's a very costly endeavor to harvest, just from the owl standpoint alone. As well as if you have water on your property and you're within the Klamath region, there's special rules for anadromous fisheries where you cannot harvest along creek zones other than a few salvage trees by and large, anywhere from 75 to 150 feet, depending on the type of creek and the topography going into this creek, on either side of the creek. So basically you're leaving football field widths of timber. So there's a large difference. A THP is only good for 5 years, and that's a new thing. It used to only be good for 3 years as of last year, but this year they changed the rule. So it's only good for 5 years. So say you're a small landowner, and you want to harvest those trees for your grandkids in 20 years. Well, you're going to have to do it, and you want to fire safe your property now. You're going to have to do a plan now, and then you're going to have to do another plan in 20 years. And it doesn't matter if you have all of this research. It all starts over from the day you initiate. So that's a big change in California, how we operate versus other states. And then this is an overview of the plan. There's several sections. I'm not going to get into it, but you can see all the things we have to evaluate, including the cumulative impacts assessment, which you have to evaluate all the public trust resources. And even within a timber harvest plan, you have to prove that it is sustainable and a sustainable plan. And what we have to do on large landowners is you have to go out and inventory your timber, and you look at the growth rates, what type of trees are there, from a species composition to age, see how they're growing. We plug all that data into a computer model, and then balance that with what we're harvesting. And you have to do that analysis over a 100-year time frame. So you have to make sure that at no time within that 100 years that you're harvesting more than you would ever grow, or that is on your property. So a timber harvest plan in the state is typically about 200 pages. I've written some that are 400 pages, depending on the size of landowner and the issues that are involved. So when you submit a plan, you don't just get to write one, but somebody gets to look at it as well. We submit them to the California Department of Forestry, and they are the lead agency. They review the plan with a multidisciplinary review board made up of mines and geology, fish and game. There's the state archaeologist, there's water quality, and fish and game. And then if you have anatomist fisheries, you could even get Fish and Wildlife and some of the federal agencies, not just state agencies, involved. So they review your plan and give you a list of questions that as an RPF I would answer on behalf of the landowner. And then once a certain time has gone by, you schedule for a pre-harvest inspection, where these inspectors have the opportunity to actually go on your land and evaluate everything you've written in the document. And then they typically come up with another set of questions after the field inspection, of which you can offer mitigations. And then during this whole time, there's also a public comment period where the public could also ask questions and send in letters of which you have to address. And then once the first review, the pre-harvest inspection, the second review, and all of the public comment has been talked about and mitigated, then and only then can the director make his determination to process a timber harvest plan. Typically, the minimum would be 65 days. Typically, these things take 6 months to 2 years to approve. So what does this do to the cost? This is the economic side of it. Well, everything in forestry is typically on 1,000 board feet. You'll see MBF throughout my talk. MBF is N is 1,000, and then BF is board foot. In California, this equates to about $70 per 1,000 of your harvest. Well, if you're getting paid only about $300 for white fir, you've got $200 and something for a small landowner to log, and you're going to pay me $70 a 1,000. There's no money in it for small landowners. So you really have to have good markets to have the small landowner be able to harvest. And then you contrast that with Oregon and Washington, which, you know, we're all friends, but we are competitors on a business level, and they're not even at $10 a 1,000. So California, well, we are trying to prove that we're sustainable and we're doing the right things, there's a cost. And the average timber harvest plan for a small landowner costs anywhere, depending on the size, but it's about $15,000 is about a minimum size timber harvest plan. I've done them that cost all the way up to $50,000. And I actually make less per hour than my mechanic and my plumber. So I really try to keep costs low. But what's happened is with the increase of cost, what you see is a decline in the blue line is the number of THPs approved through CAL FIRE. So we've seen a drastic decline from about 1,000 plans. My numbers you really can't see, but actually I can even see. It's supposed to be in the 80s, late 90s. All the way down to about 2008 with the crash of the economy. You know, we're approving less than 200 plans a year. But what you're also seeing is the number of acres per timber harvest plan is increasing. So what that's saying is only the large landowners are able to harvest. So the small landowner that might have fire issues or insect attack, because you don't, with limited exceptions, you can harvest through an exemption if you have disease, but you're only allowed to take 10%. But regardless, almost all cases you need to follow this process, and it's expensive. So, and then that's private land. On the Forest Service, it's a little bit different scenario. They follow NEPA, they don't have CEQA, but NEPA is their National Environmental Policy Act. And that is a very similar but different process. It takes years to get NEPA documents approved. And unfortunately, Forest Service ends up in court a lot. And as a result, their harvests have declined. So while they might be growing in Siskiyou County, this is a figure that I was given from a forestry friend named Steve Henson. Siskiyou County, on federal lands alone, we grow about 800 million board feet a year. Yet we only harvest about 45 million, and that's on average. It goes up and down depending on budgets and what gets through. And you probably correct me on that, but that's about the last numbers I saw from, like, I think these numbers are from like 2009, 2010. 45 million board feet a year. So is that sustainable when you have that much disparity between growth and harvest? Because what happens to that accumulated growth? You end up with a picture in the background. So, oh, wrong button. So this is real quickly, this is on the Klamath National Forest. This is annual net growth. So this is the net growth. That's the mortality. And then that's what they're actually harvesting in 2009. So you can see that we're actually losing more timber that's dying in our forests than we're harvesting. You know, when there is a benefit to having snags and dead trees on the landscape from a holistic forestry standpoint, but at some point you're setting yourself up for catastrophic fire and other issues that I'll get into. And then that's the Shasta Trinity National Forest within Siskiyou County as well. So you can see that our national forests are growing way more than we're harvesting. And it's not just California-centric, it's a whole trend on federal lands throughout the Pacific coast. So you can see that 1986, 87 kind of being a magic year. Ron might remember what happened then, but that's the start of the NSO, the Spotted Owl Wars. And once the Forest Service stopped harvesting, the growth of course went up because you're not harvesting your growth. The removals went down, or harvest, but then also the mortality line is starting to go up. So, and then what does that do to our rural economies when we're not harvesting? Well, federal land, it was set up in 1906 under the Organic Act that they would harvest 25% of their land in payment in lieu of taxes. So since the federal government in Siskiyou County owns a little over 60% of this county, they don't pay taxes to our county to support schools and roads like other property owners. The agreement was that they would pay 25% in lieu of those taxes. Well, with the decrease in volume, the revenues went away, and hence our schools and roads and our rural economies started to feel the effect. And again, you can see the huge decline in the late 80s. And then, as far as what that did to jobs, forestry is a heavily industrial, or I don't know if I'm using the right word, but it's a very labor-intensive field. There was a study done from the University of Massachusetts, and I don't know how well you can see this, but at the very top, you'll see restoration forestry, sustainable forest management. What this slide is showing is that for every $1 of investment in whatever sector across the United States, where do you get your biggest bang for your buck? And what they were doing is trying to figure out from a federal standpoint, where do we invest our money to get people back to work with the crash of the economy? You get your most bang for your buck in forestry. It's almost 40 jobs per $1 million of investment. The second would be agriculture. I mean, we're almost double agriculture. It's very labor intensive, even with the mechanization of some of our forests. And then look at other green jobs. I mean, we're not even, you can take both the solar and wind, where you see a lot of subsidies going, and we're really not creating, even if you add all those together, the same ballpark that you would if we were to get in and thin forest. So, a little bit about forests in California. Our forests evolved with insects, disease, and fire. There's a fire, you probably have heard of the fire triangle, maybe, but there's also a disease disturbance triangle. And what it shows is that if you have an overabundance of insects, then one of the other legs of that pyramid is going to take over and kind of compensate. So if you have a lot of insects, you're probably going to get fire. If you have a lot of disease, you're probably going to get insects. You know, it's kind of a circular relationship there. In California, we end up having a lot of both, with this especially large fires. And fires account for 1/5 of global carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. So, we know in forestry, and this is California specific, but I'm sure these principles apply to other forests, but we know that when we get to certain basal area is a measurement in forestry that is a measurement of density. It's a measurement of the square foot area of stump. And we can say, okay, if there's 400 to 500 square feet, that's a very dense forest, that we are going to get insect attacks. And we can almost pinpoint what insect, and this is Forest Service research through the Pacific, thank you, the DSW. And this is John Wee, if you guys know John Wee, but this is his research. And basically what it shows is, by species, we can tell you when you get to a certain stocking level, you'll get insects. Whereas if you keep your forest thinner, you won't get as many insects. Insects will always be present, you just won't get them at epidemic levels. Also, that line, that regression line, is a line showing, this is growth. So it's also showing that as your trees get thicker and thicker, your growth declines. Whereas the thinner spaced your trees are, you have better growth. And I'm sure most of you garden. An easy analogy is if you guys plant carrots in the spring, you plant all your carrot seeds, and then once you start seeing green tops, you go pick and pluck every other one. Otherwise, you're going to end up with toothpicks. But if you pick and pluck, you're going to end up with nice-sized carrots. Same thing with forestry. If you have too many stems per acre, your trees are not going to grow. They're going to be small, and you're going to get insects. So you're going to get this. So we do have stands that are looking like this in Siskiyou County. There's a lot of lodgepole die-off. That fire triangle, what comes next? Fire. It's not a matter of if it's going to burn, but when. A lot of our fires in California are lightning strike caused fires. Obviously, we have a lot of people in our forest, so there is the human element, but historically our fires were lightning. And historically, we have a fire in California every 5 to 30 years. Exception being on the coast again, because that's a completely different ecosystem. It's wetter. Fires don't get started as readily. Their fire interval is, on the 200-year scale. But how do we know this? We know this because of charcoal deposits, fire scars, and historical accounts. And fire plays a very important role in our Sierra and Cascade forests. Since we don't have the moist environment like the coast, we don't get a lot of fungal decomposition. We rely on nutrient cycling from fires. Fires also thin out our forests. They kill the weed, they create a mosaic of habitat types, so you get a diversity of wildlife. And we know Native Americans burn about 1 million acres a year. They did this for all sorts of reasons. And then, I won't read these, but you can read them real quick, but there's evidence even from the 1800s that we had a lot of fires burning. And then yet one more, and they even burn in Oregon. So it's a lot of fire. So what happens when fire is not allowed to burn? Well, we get an increase of fuel loading, which then decreases forest health. It decreases the openness of the stand. And the most important one, in my opinion, from a wildlife standpoint, is it changes the species composition. Because our forests have evolved with fire on a scale of every 5 to 30 years, you end up with trees that love a lot of open sunlight and bare mineral soil. When you start to close in those canopies and it gets dark, you end up with a lot of trees that are more shade-loving, and like the fir trees. They're shade-loving, they're not as drought-tolerant, and a lot of sunlight doesn't hit the forest floor. I've got a picture of that I'll show you. And then you lose forage for your wildlife. The other effect with wildfire is it puts up a lot of particulate matter. So this is the fire triangle. So how do we affect fire? We can talk about it's influenced by the topography, the weather, and the fuel. Of those, the only one that I personally feel we have an influence over is fuel. Some people will argue weather, but my argument still is, you need to manage the fuel if weather is an issue, because your trees will be more resistant if they're thinned out. So, just some quick facts on wildlife and its effects, fire's effect on wildlife. Basically, there's just some studies that show that you will lose forage when you get to overstock stands. And this is what I'm talking about by an overstock stand. You lose your primary vegetation. You know, this is what we call the topper and understory. There's literally nothing growing. The only thing this is good for, in my opinion, is this is where yellow jackets live. But what I see here is a lot of white fir with a heavy fuel loading that's setting itself up to burn. So, and the other thing I would say about this slide, how many people think there's more than one age class in that photo? Would you say those trees are different ages because they're different sizes? Yeah. Those trees are all the same age. So you end up with what to a lot of people would say, oh, well, this, we need to selectively manage this. We need to manage it by thinning it out and selectively logging. But that's not how this stand is set up. This is an even age stand. So you need to treat the whole stand as a whole. This is a spotted owl study. And what this shows is that species fitness is a measure of how many offspring and lifespan of species. And this is showing that when you have a diversity of habitats, usually when it's in about a 50-50 mix, you have the highest species fitness, the highest survival, the highest offspring rate, versus if you have too much of one thing. So this dark would be a closed canopy forest, not necessarily oak growth, but like the slide I showed you where, you know, it's closed canopy. A lot of people would consider that an oak growth forest. You can see there's low fitness just as much as if you had an entire area burn or an owl was trying to live in the middle of the meadow. And really, and then if you kind of get on the margins of either extreme, you're in the medium. But the best survivability, and I would say this is probably true with most species that aren't either early sterile or late sterile dependent, is when you have a diversity of habitat types. And a way to think of this is like for the spotted owl, is they do nest in a closed canopy forest, and that would be considered their bedroom, but they also need a kitchen. So they need that open forest where one of their primary food source is mice and wood rats. Mice and wood rats need all those forbs and grasses for their food source, so that's why you need the openings. So this is what a lot of our forests look like. Overstock stands. This is what they used to look like. We used to have anywhere from 40 to 80 trees on average. That's not to say that there weren't forests that looked like this historically, but by and large, because of the effects of fire, there were pockets of this, but a lot more of this, where you did have openings where you could literally ride a horse through. And what happened, how this affected fire, is ponderosa pine does not like shade. It needs full sunlight. It self-prunes because it doesn't like shade. It doesn't even like its own branches to shade out each other. So it will self-prune, which is also an adaptation to fire, because if you can keep the fire on the ground without getting your crown, you've got a better chance of surviving. So fire historically would burn off the brush, left the green stuff intact, and went on its merry way. So we can emulate that now by thinning out our forests and reducing fuel ladders. And this is a lot of how forestry is being done in California, where you're reducing the fuel ladders so it doesn't get into the crown. And this is an example of that. This was the 99 Negro fire from Mohawk County. You can see the untreated fire where it was a crown fire, and then the thin stands where the fire laid down. And then this is a picture of a low-intensity fire creeping across the forest floor. The ladder fuels are removed. And this is probably how things happen more often. So this is modern forestry. This is a lot of what we do for our company in California. We do a lot of thinning where we're removing those ladder fuels. And we also do this. This was a comment that trees will never grow on the site that was printed in the San Francisco Chronicle. Okay. And a lot of people would say, how is clear cutting sustainable? And why do you do it? And I would say there's several reasons on why we practice evenage management in this state. Let me back up by saying, with our forest practice rules, we can only harvest 20 acres is the maximum clear cut size. We can go up to 30 acres if we explain and justify with good reason why we need to increase it. But if you can imagine a blanket of trees from one end of the state to the other, or from one end of a watershed to the other, there's not a lot of wildlife habitat diversity there. It's just a blanket of trees without the openings that we need. So clear cuts do provide openings. They, you can get improved growth on your trees. Let me show you that.
How old were those trees?
Those?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I think that's about a 12-year-old plantation. Maybe 10? I don't know, I think it's 10 to 12 years old.
I bet it's less than that.
No, let me count.
Counting like 8 or 9.
You get another, look, you're counting 8 or 9 and then add 1 or 2. So we'll call it 10 just around. But, and so you will get better growth rates. We have a heavy demand for forest products. So again, with the cost and the demand for forest products is pushing more of our industrial forest landowners to go in this direction. We are learning a lot, and we are able to now plant mixed species. You know, we get criticized a lot because, oh, it's all ponderosa pine, all they do is monoculture. Well, there's a reason for that. When you look at the physiology of why we plant ponderosa pine, they love sun. White fir, incense cedar, those are typically understory components in our Sierras. They will, you know, there is no absolutes in forestry. They will come in as the stand starts to grow up. However, now with a lot of our nursery techniques, we are able to get them to be open grown in plantations, and that is ponderosa pine Doug fir. And our seed, we collect seed from the local area. We don't plant trees that were cones picked in Mount Shasta and plant them in Hilt, just like we wouldn't take trees from Tahoe and plant them in Siskiyou County. There's rules against that. Our state is broken up into seed zones. So you've got elevation, aspect, which is which side of the hill you're on, and species concerns that we deal with. And what we do is, years before we ever go out and clear cut an area, we would go select seeds from the best growing trees, harvest those seeds, store them in a nursery, and then before we're ready, we would outplant them. We do get increased growth rates when we control vegetation. And this is a plantation, this is the Shao plantation out of the Cloud Flats. And it's one of the oldest plantations in the state, if not the United States. And I've taken people there, it's on Forest Service land, and it was planted by, I believe the guy's last name was Shao, and hence the name of the Shao plantation, but they've done a heck of a job maintaining it, and I've taken people out there and they can't believe it's not overgrowth. So, I know I've kind of cut it short with the whole clear cutting thing, but I expect to answer a lot more questions, but I just kind of wanted to touch into that industrial forest management. But this is really why I believe in industrial forestry, is kind of this. It's like, I do believe in, quote, saving our forests, and you have to manage for fire. And anyways, thanks to those people for providing me some slides. Anyways, so with that, thank you.
Thank you. Normally, you know, we go back and forth with questions, but why don't we hold our questions and have Marty Main speak, and then we can ask all those questions afterwards. If you have questions for Marty during his presentation, that's one thing, but keep those questions you might have for Danielle till the end.
Part of the advance.
Let's get you out of here.
Well, my name's Marty Main. Of Great talk on forestry. A primer, that was really good. Really enjoyed that. I'd like to know who I'm speaking to. I'm not from around here. I'm from Ashland, Medford. Are we mostly small woodland owners? How many are small woodland owners? What else? Professionals? Resource professionals? Yeah. A lot, okay. Interested public? Yeah. How about Rainbow Ridge? How many people Rainbow Ridge? Okay. Well, I'm from Medford, Ashland, Southern Oregon. Regulatory environment is much different.
Yes.
We're envious.
So it really affects what's possible. I've been in business now for 33 years, doing consulting forestry in Southern Oregon. I've worked most of that time with small woodland owners, and ranged from as small as you can get and be a woodland owner up to several thousand acres. It's been a great career. I'm still in the middle of it. I love it. I resent that there's more forest land in California than in Oregon. But I don't resent 1,100 rules.
That's just in the forest practice rules.
Forest practice and rules. I was asked to talk about restoration forestry. And restoration, in my career, we've had a series of words that suddenly gained a lot of use, both professionally in the public and the media. The current one is restoration, and it's got all kinds of meanings, depending on who you're talking to. So I'm going to backpedal a little bit. My talk really isn't on restoration forestry, but the concepts of restoration and the idea that human beings can go into the woods and do good things, I firmly believe in that. And so a lot of my work over the last 30 plus years has been in and around trying to do restoration type of work, trying to go into our stands and our forest lands and try to act respectfully with them. Of course that's easily said, and of course that's what I'd say here. The proof's in the pudding, out on the land. It's complex. I like that word that you had in the introductory talk. The things that I'm going to offer you tonight, I'm going to show you a lot of slides of stuff we've done in the area that up in Ashland. And I'm going to say it's out of your area. Now it's not very far out, but those of us in forestry, and anytime you work with ecosystems, you've got a lot of reverence for the local scene, the local community, the local soils and the species. I was driving in here, and of course I drive through Mount Shasta all the time. I've done contracts on the Mount Shasta Ranger District in my past, so I'm familiar, but there's a unique forest here that we don't have. So take my words with a grain of salt here. I'm out of the area. But fundamentally, what we as human beings have been doing since we climbed out of the trees is manipulate vegetation to achieve our objectives. That's what we do. We've been doing that for a long, long time. My brother's a farmer. He does it. But we go back in our history, that's what we do. I was asked to comment on doing nothing. Is doing nothing okay? Absolutely. I say doing nothing is fine. And I support any landowner who chooses to do nothing. That's a management choice. And don't do anything until you're ready to do something. That's an easy rule. But there's consequences for a decision to do nothing. And that's what forestry is about. So an informed decision, that's what I really like. If you have the information and you choose to do nothing, hey, that's great. That's great. But get the information. So I'm going to go through a bunch of slides here. just talk about some of the stuff that I've been involved in over the last 30 plus years. So I'm going to focus primarily in and around the Ashland watershed. How many here know about the Ashland watershed? Just a show of hands. I've heard about it, yeah, about half. We have a former expert on the Ashland watershed in the crowd.
Can't hide.
So that's a picture of the watershed, but what I'm going to talk to you about is how management and operations change depending on the ownership. You see up in town there, Ashland, and then just outside of town we have a whole layer of small woodland owners. And then the actual watershed boundary, which is here, there's only two owners. The U.S. Forest Service and the City of Ashland. The City of Ashland owns a piece right in the center here and up in the throat of the watershed. Reeder Reservoir is the reservoir that provides water for the City of Ashland. My company has been working with the city in managing their land since 1995. And I've worked with private small woodland owners in the interface area since '82 when I planted my first tree on a private parcel. So it's interesting how things change depending on who owns the land and how you go about dealing with that. So this is the watershed. This is the issues and concerns in the Ashland watershed. Now the Ashland watershed is unique in that it hasn't been logged much. It's been a watershed since the early part of the 20th century, 1900s. So very important that way. It's also underlaid by decomposed granitic soils, which are the most erosive soils that we have. So some great sensitivity about that. It has probably one of the best population of spotted owls on the West Coast, right in the watershed. So we've got a whole host of issues. There's significant forest health and silvicultural concerns. Stand density that Danielle talked about. We have some serious forest diseases, dwarf mistletoe, laminated root disease, and of course insects. There's geological and slope stability issues. A lot of the watershed ended up down on the plaza in Ashland in 1997, delivered by a big storm. One of the primary places, like I said, on the West Coast for late successional, it is a late successional reserve, mandated for that by the Forest Service. Important, very important wildlife values, particularly spotted owl and more recently Pacific fisher. It's a municipal watershed, so people in town feel very strongly about that. And Ashland has a reputation for feeling very strongly about a lot of things. And it's become a destination area for bicycles, hikers. Yeah. So sometimes I ask myself, now why was it I decided I wanted to do this work? With all these strong feelings. It's topographically steep and inaccessible. There's only one road through it. Really steep, so that limits the management options. And it's off the charts in terms of fire hazard. And that's largely because we started excluding fire. Danielle talked a lot about that. I'm not going to go into detail there, but with no logging, no management for 100 years, and it's not no, there has been some, but this is a big block of land that's pretty unique because it hasn't had that overlay. It's just fire. Lack of fire has caused a lot of what we see here. And this affects every one of them. Everybody that feels strongly, and they all feel strongly. But you all just, oh, it feels really strong. These people are, you know, oh, people in town, it's like, so That's what it feels like to be a resource professional, I think. So I retitled my talk to make it so that we can have so I can let everybody feel. Is anybody like writing this down? But basically what we do comes back to some basic things. It applies to the smallest small woodland owner or the biggest ownership. Vegetation is determined, the vegetation on your property is determined by these things. The physical environmental variables, the successionary pathways that vegetation goes through, the historical disturbance regime. Danielle talked about fire, and then what's been done in the recent management history. That can be 150 years, it can be 50 years, whatever. That's why the vegetation that's on your property is affected by these patterns. Very important concept. I'm sorry, maybe all of you know it, but I'm just going to run through it. Every time I go back to it, I think it's really important. It's the whole concept of disturbance. Management is a form, it's a planned disturbance. It's a choice we're making to go manipulate the vegetation. Well, that's been happening for a long time out there. These forests are used to having things happen out there. Our trick as human beings, at least the way I've always looked at it, is can we, and you use the word emulate, I love that word. Can we do what we need to achieve our objectives in a pattern that resembles what was historically out there? The closer we are to that, I start to feel a little better. Easy to say, tough to do. I love this piece of work that this fellow developed in 1981 because it really applies to the different species and what happens based on the type of disturbance over here. High intensity, fire suppression, low intensity, high intensity. If you want to promote these two species, there it is. That's what they grew up with. Frequent, low intensity. They're well selected and adapted to survive low intensity types of disturbance. On the other hand, you see some of the things, some of the species here that, hey, bring on high intensity fire. We love it. Infrequent high intensity fire. And of course, it's unfair to categorize fire in just those two types, but there's all kinds of ranges of fire. Pyrodiversity.
Where would you put poison oak in that?
Poison.
It's happy everywhere.
Poison oak is a bummer.
Understatement.
It's definitely an endurer.
Yeah.
That's probably, but poison oak seems to do well with almost any kind of disturbance. The more disturbance, the more it likes it. So, how did things change as a result of fire exclusion? You guys can read them as easy as I can, and we'll go through these now, each one, and talk about how things have changed and what's that mean for us as small woodland owners, as land managers. What do we do with that? This is in our area, in the Ashland watershed area, in the interface. And the thing that's amazing about this is with no disturbance for a long period of time, 2002 was a drought year, but look what happened to the population of insects here. 2000, relatively small. Look how fast they can respond and become a high-intensity form of disturbance. Insects have that capability. And of course, there's a different set of insects for each species of tree. So as forestry professionals or as small woodland owners, if you happen to have a big stand of ponderosa pine around your home and it gets to be a drought year, you've got something to think about. I would probably advise against the strategy of doing nothing. So here's pictures in Ashland. This is 2002. This is the kind of mortality of trees. This is right on the edge of town. So scary for a lot of folks, and rightfully so. This is a picture of dwarf mistletoe and Douglas fir. Causes a significant decline and eventual death of the tree. Really, do you guys have that? You experience it around here? Okay, from a fire perspective, have a creeping ground fire here. This is all fine fuels in here. So trees that historically, frequent low intensity fire would pre-select these types of trees and remove them. Because this is a fire ladder. But, true to the community of Ashland and the work that I do, spotted owls love that. That's where they nest. Pacific fisher love to go hunt for the prey up in here. The prey species for both species go up and live in these brooms. So this drives you nuts sometimes. So are we managing for fire? Are we managing for forest health? Are we managing for what? No, we're managed for all of them. Well, what do you want me to do here? So what do? If you have 5 acres, a little different than if you have 5,000. If you have 5,000, you spatially arrange these things to achieve maximum objectives, if you can. So Danielle gave some great talks. This was a prescribed burn we did on City of Ashland land just about a month ago. It came into prescription. My company had done the understory thinning on this job, piled and burned, kind of prepared the site for fire. Then we went in and actually helicopter logged on this site. We did the understory work in about 2000, 1999, 2000, helicopter logged in 2004. And then we're able to get fire onto the site, trying to get back to the historic disturbance regime. And away from this kind of, away from this kind of fire. And that fire is not necessarily wrong or incorrect, it just doesn't fit our objectives very well. But there's places in the West where, in all fire environments, some percentage of high intensity fire is appropriate. But how to implement it is a challenge. So species composition, we talked about vegetation changing. This is from plot data on the city lands, but I wanted to show you, in 1899, a guy went through and did a basal area assessment by species, ponderosa pine, sugar pine, Doug fir, oak, and madrone. This is what he found. And on city lands today, this is what we have. Well, that, in 100 years, is a pretty amazing change in species composition. What it's saying is we human beings, with what we've done, have really changed the forest. Changed it big time. I'd like to point this out. These plots had one high-intensity fire. And it happened in 1901. And this is what we had. When we had plots that had 2 infrequent high-intensity fires. Look what happened here.
So, are you saying there's no ponderosa pine and there's no sugar pine?
That's what I'm saying.
So where did they go?
Well, it had to be a disturbance of some kind. I would say could have been log, certainly high-intensity fire, certainly insects as a possibility, but probably competition. A lot of understory competition over 100 years. So it's a complex picture, but a very good question. But this is just plot data, and so a lot of stuff to talk about here. This is a species composition change going on. This is where we prescribe burn. Douglas fir in the overstory, Pacific madrone in the understory coming up. This is in our area. You guys probably a little bit different here, but historically this would have been a pine oak savanna 150 years ago. This is right up outside of the city of Ashland. Again, and you showed some good pictures of tremendous stalking around a big black oak. I saw you guys have black oaks here. Black oaks are a fire species. They like fire better than a lot of the other hardwoods. But they really don't like a whole bunch of competition for resources. Pacific fisher, this is a great wildlife tree. Pacific fisher nests in those guys. So here's the landslide event in Ashland. New Year's Day in 1997, bring on the new year. Bring on the mud and sand. This is just a very erosive piece of landscape. So now we're going to talk about, well, what can we do? Basically, we can modify vegetation, 3 characteristics: the structure of the stand, the density of the stand, the composition. We've already been talking about some of these concepts. That's basically what we all do. This is a way that we as professionals, with our plot data, we go out and we see where any particular stand is on this graph. And it's interesting, most stands, we have a theoretical maximum where mortality starts exceeding survival at this point. Most of the stands in the Ashland watershed are in here. So, and Danielle had some good comments about basal area and thinning. Generally in forestry, we like to see it somewhere, cut back to here, grow it back to there, so forth and so on, depending on the objectives of the owner. So here's a stand, overstory ponderosa pine, understory Douglas fir. Species composition change. The structure, very dense forest, very dense. It'd be way up on that graph, around 80 or 90. And you can see that we did have ponderosa pine originally. It's coming back strongly in Douglas fir. But the structure is just a dense, multi-layered structure, whereas historically it would have been open pine, the same thing that you talked about. So a lot of these concepts do happen. This is a stand where we have no ladder fuels. Great from a fire perspective, but we really like to keep the fire benefits. And this particular stand is too dense to maintain healthy individual trees. We just marked this stand. We're going to be logging it this year. Market went up. The landowner's been waiting 5 or 6 or 7 years. But we will, our primary objective is to maintain a stand that is favorable, can receive fire without a lot of damage. So we talked a lot about individual stand management practices, but a lot of the stuff we do ends up on a landscape level. And in the, I think it was 2000, 2001, the city asked me to rate all these parcels out here, all this landscape in the interface for fire, for susceptibility to fire. And there were 2,600 acres, 260 parcels. And I said, I'm not going to try to look at individual parcels, but I am going to try to rate each of these areas based on the vegetation for susceptibility to fire. The map that we had at the time just said the whole thing, extreme. So the city wanted to apply for grants to modify the vegetation to achieve the objective. Fire coming into this town is not a desirable thing. And we had all these individual small woodland owners, Forest Service up here. So we rated the vegetation, we got grant money. I got the data through 2008. A bunch of people went and did this kind of work around their homes. Up until that point, a lot of people were not into murdering trees. They didn't like that concept. But they decided it'd be better to kill a few trees rather than see their home burn up. So we got this concept of defensible space. A lot of folks in town, really a lot of folks, and throughout Southern Oregon, have built homes in forests now that are less likely to burn. What are we doing time-wise? So, you know, management objectives, manipulate vegetation, achieve the objectives. Great guy here, Carl. So City of Ashland, when I started in 1995, said, these are our objectives. This is the primary objective, and this is the one we're concerned about. So like any land manager, any professional, I looked at their ownership and I made units. And small woodland owners, same thing. You own 10 acres, you go out there and you divide it into workable pieces, little units. Today I was up in this area. These are areas that I gave this map to the city and said, these are the priority areas from a fire management perspective. Let's do something from a fire management. You can see that town there, fire tends to come up the canyon, work its way up the canyon. We want to create opportunities to try to stop an advancing fire. This is the same map. These are stands that had significant silvicultural, forest health, disease, insect issues. Big chunk of the ownership, as you've seen by some of the pictures. These are the areas in the ownership that an engineering geologist said, major issue here. So those were our three primary objectives. Of course, we put them all together and went, wow. Now we've got competing objectives, but in some places, you know, we really could go up into unit C2 at the top there. The prescribed burn was in E2 a month ago. You know, we're trying to create wildfire management or fire management really took the priority in that situation. And elsewhere, each of these took a priority. In these slope stability, geologically sensitive areas, sometimes we do nothing. Informed decision. So a few pictures. This is in unit C2 on the city land. This is when we started. Not too good from a fire management perspective. That's right after we've thinned, put all the stuff on the ground. Not too good from a fire management perspective, but getting a little better. Oh, looking better now. Then we planted trees there, planted ponderosa pine, south slope, and actually underburned that last year. I forgot to put a slide into that. So, I don't think we need to talk. I put this in because small woodland owners can choose, you know, which trees they want to go. You can all see that this tree is struggling, and this one's looking pretty good. This is a damaged tree, could be removed. Again, same concept. If you're doing stand improvement, you can be considering which trees would go out. This is on city land. This dense manzanita brush field. This is a 5-acre patch with houses all around it. So we removed the manzanita, planted native grasses, planted some undestroyed seedlings, and now we've got a stand that's much better, closer to what we think was there historically. Different area. This is in the Cascades now. Again, opportunities for stand improvement. You guys have, some of you have heard Eric Knapp talk spatial patterning out in the forest. Very cool concept, developing some understanding that the forest has different types of densities in the historical forest. And this is a natural patch opening, probably because of shallow soils. It's nice to be able to emulate those structural conditions. Here's the before of one of the trails on the city of Ashland. Here's after treatment. Here's a before and after again. One of the stands in the interface in the after. This is the same view. That blue flag, you can see it there in the drone. After we like to keep the drone if we can. And of course, here's a picture of prescribed burning. Danielle showed you. This is in one of the units on the city land that we burned in a joint project with the Forest Service in 2007. These are really prized old trees in the watershed. This will be 250, 300 years old. We thin around them. This was helicopter logged to try to reduce stand densities and fire danger, reduce the likelihood of insect attack. And you can see these are small. There's a lot going up in one left here with the helicopter. This is only one type of harvest system. It happened to fit there. The soils are very erosive. We don't want to build roads or run equipment on them. And it's a municipal watershed. There's the landing. Helicopters are really expensive. Most smallwoodland owners won't use a helicopter to do your work if that's one of your objectives. But you can see our objective was to thin from below, primarily the lion's share of the material is this size. So each step along the way, we've talked about small woodland owners, then the next step is the city of Ashland. When I work with a small woodland owner, I'm working with one person. And it's socially simple, unless they're married. Then it gets a little more complex. Then you got to wrestle, different objectives, husband and wife. Not really. You do a little marriage counseling now again in this profession, but it's fun. In '95, I decided to go the next step up and work with 20,000 residents, the city of Ashland. That got a little more complex in a hurry. There was a Forest Lands Commission, the city staff, but the city owns 645 acres in the watershed. The Forest Service owns about 14,000. If the city was going to achieve their objectives, eventually we have to work with the Forest Service. So this project, Ashland Forest Resiliency, was a project to look at the entire watershed and manage it collectively. There's a statement. To do that, the Forest Service had been trying for a long time to do something in the watershed and had run into social issues with the residents and the community for a long time. Am I misspeaking at all, John? That's right. The Forest Service finally said, okay, all right, let's give some of the responsibilities to some of these locals who think they really know what they're doing. They got smart. The Forest Service finally said, okay, we've got to involve the local people. So there's 4 organizations involved. You can see them, that we each have our roles. The Forest Service decided to use a stewardship agreement, relatively unique. And so the 4 parties have been working together to do this work. Now this is a complicated social arrangement. And so it really changes how I interact, how the people interact. Now we have, how many people live in the country? 250 million or whatever it is, owners of this land that all have theoretically a say. So scale of reference becomes real important. We fortunately got funding from Obama under the ARA dollars, and were awarded money to finance this. And so I was involved in helping develop prescriptions, silvicultural prescriptions on these acres. I was involved with marking Forest Service has the crews, it's their trees, their ownership, so kind of a lot of issues there, you know, internal, what stays in the Forest Service and what gets handed back and forth. Holy mackerel. I really want to go back and work with the small woodland owners. But, I mean, this is a big chunk of ground, really important, really precious, a lot of people feel strongly about it. And at this point, over 3,200 acres have been treated. The process was started in 2000. The Forest Service had been working, had two projects that went, they tried to get going but couldn't really get them going. Too much resistance. We started in 2004 under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, I think it was called, George Bush. And it allowed communities to develop their own program that the Forest Service had to consider. So finally by 2009, I think, it took 5 years. I think you talked about how long it takes, you know. Working with a federal agency, boy, you go fast forward and backpedal fast and sideways, and it's quite a challenge. But at this point now, we just completed, I was involved in overseeing helicopter logging, similar to the city, because of our background in the city, we were asked to oversee that. That's a lot of board feet that went to local mills. We had a whole lot of community engagement, and that was part of the entire package, that we were going to reach out to the public and have them involved. And boy, I found tours out in the woods the best thing, over and over. Get them out in there. Don't sit in the rooms and argue. Get out and look at the woods and have a conversation. We have a real nice monitoring. The Nature Conservancy is in charge of monitoring, so they're doing some really nice research up there, or not so much research, but monitoring and some research. They picked up additional funding. We got local workforce got really involved in job training and employment. Lomacotsi Restoration Group, some of you may know them, they've been down in this area, and they've really taken that, and lots of people have been up there working. Of course, kids, try to get the youngsters involved. So there's where we're at this point with this project. These slides make it look easy and all accomplishment. This is the rose-colored glasses. If we had longer, I'd tell you some of the other things it takes to get to this point. Or John, maybe John, you can talk another time with the group here. Very challenging. Again, I'm going to finish with this idea that, you know, if you have I work with an owner, and you saw a slide on some of their lands, right up in here, 400 acres, right on the edge of the watershed. And he's got this huge manzanita brush field that got started after a fire in 1901 and then a second fire in 1973. And if you take a 1 acre patch of manzanita in there, it's solid manzanita. You say, man, no diversity. You know, small woodland owner, we should do something with that. But it's a 100 acre patch of manzanita. Okay, so on that scale, then boy, that's a fire hazard. It really changes. What do you want to do, landowner? Oh, I don't want the fire. I'm like, okay, well, but really expensive. Okay, but then we go to the scale of the Ashland watershed, and that 100 acre manzanita brush field, then if you look at the entire watershed, there's hardly any manzanita. And so on a more of a landscape level, that 100 acre manzanita patch would be really good to retain. You know, because there isn't much of it around. Okay, so scale of reference. Individual landowner with manzanita. Then we have Forest Service, city, small woodland owners, industrial forestry land. What do we want there? That changes. Then if we step back even farther and we look from a satellite, Pacific Northwest, and that little 1 acre manzanita or 40 acre, 100 acre manzanita brush field, you look at Pacific Northwest, we have a big block of old growth in this low elevation, low to mid elevation old growth here, dry eastern end of the Siskiyous, big chance for wildfire. This is really a special piece of real estate on that level. So, you know, all of it changes depending on which scale you look at, who your owner is, and how you interact with them. Danielle said about our markets now, we get affected nationally and internationally by, you know, internationally. Certainly our log products are going here and there, and we're getting diseases delivered to us, and we're sending, complex is a good word. So this is the one of the end products of a ridge line that is less fire prone. And that's Ashland looking up in the watershed with smoke. A lot of years there was no smoke, and there's a lot of forest diseases that smoke impacts. We didn't realize that until recently, how important smoke and fire are in the forest ecosystem. That's what I've got for you guys.
Feel free to ask questions of Danielle or Marty. Hopefully you've been holding on to them the whole time.
Marty, what about the economics of your helicopter logging? Money loser or money gainer?
Short answer or long answer? Short answer is losing. The helicopter logging was subsidized by the Obama dollars, stimulus dollars. We like to think it wasn't helicopter logging, it was helicopter fuel removal. And
After a different goal.
yeah. So if we take the project by itself and look at the dollars that went into the project and what we got out of our products, and I should have brought a slide because that's a great question and very pertinent. It's a loser. Okay? But we hadn't done anything in there for 50 years. So we take those dollars and spread them out over 50 years, and we probably spent less per acre over 50 years than a lot of other Forest Service ownership. And if we take those dollars that we spent and we consider what's the value of water, I mean, I'm talking to Californians now. My brother's a farmer. Water is going to be, in a watershed like this, if it burned, the impact on water alone, let alone the recreational values and all. So we invested. We invested in a piece of ground. We invested in maintaining spotted owl habitat. Da, 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 da. So again, it's kind of your scale. If you look at the project, $741 a thousand to log, oh man, that's through the roof. But in the context, then, you know, maybe it's just a plain wise investment.
The other thing I was surprised with is that you had areas that you set aside and did nothing that were geologically sensitive, which is also going to be more sensitive if that does burn. The rate of slippage is going to be increased dramatically. I'm surprised you left it alone.
Do you hire out?
Yeah, I'll give you my card.
The geologist said, no cutting, not one tree. If you cut that tree, this was on city land, and it slides in a court of law, you aggravate it.
That's true.
So the city said, well, what are we going to do? Well, there's a house in the draw down there. We're not going to do anything. I said, you don't do anything, those trees are going to be dead in 10 years. They're dead now.
And fire prone.
And fire prone, and yeah. So, you know, doing nothing is probably not the right answer, but the geologist has to. Tough stuff.
Actually, the lawyers ruled it out.
I think what you did is build a lot of public trust by doing a project like that. You know, you haven't done anything for 50 years, and you start out small, and you end up, you know, successful. You know, people say, hey, you know, it really wasn't that bad. The next time you enter that watershed for your next project, because this isn't going to be the last one, you know, you've already got a leg up. You have a success story to build on, and you can just keep doing good work. And I think, you know, that's what we have to do in this era.
Well, you know, how do you say it in, you know, in short? I can say that it took my entire career. People in Ashland, the community, the city said, we don't want anything done up there when I first came to Southern Oregon. The professionals knew that it would burn. It was a horrible fire hazard, and all the values would be gone. But the public and the environmental community, you saw all those important values. So, and the public was right to be mistrustful, you know? And I'll just tell you, this is my own bias. I love small woodland owners. They're just people that they have a little chunk of the earth, and they're going to go out and try to do what's right, and they confront the same issues that the rest of us do, and they're pretty pragmatic. And so, you know, small woodland owners, like a lot of people in the room, have an important role to play in helping build public trust. But it took a long time. But of course, Ashland's real environmentally oriented. But at this point, I'd say, yeah, we have a lot of social license. There's still a lawsuit, but we were able to move forward. So we'll see. But, you know, with all the public oversight, then if we misbehave, it's going to come back pretty quick, too. And it should.
So you talked a lot about the differences between regulations between California and Oregon and Washington, and what the kind of logging that you're talking about here in this watershed is a lot different than the industrial logging that you see when you're on vacation going up Interstate 5 or like over on the coast when you get into those Douglas fir stands and you know, those huge clear cuts. And they're huge. And, you know, I don't know if the states are doing monitoring about how that's going and how that's affecting the spotted owls, and also then how much more valuable than what is left is for, especially for the spotted owls, and we're talking more for us. So what do you think about the regulations in Oregon, Washington versus California? And
California is real restrictive. I listened to what Danielle had to go through for a small woodland owner. I probably wouldn't have been employed in Oregon at doing what I do. I mean, we are a lot more lenient. We have a good Oregon Forest Practices Act. It's administered differently, but we don't go through the formal timber harvest plan that I mean, 2 years. I just wrote down some of the numbers and went, oh boy.
Yeah, the big difference I know of in Oregon forestry versus California is they have forest practice rules like we do. They have to deal with the Clean Water Act like we do. In California, we have to prove to the state through the document that we're not going to cause an effect. In Oregon, it's more monitoring, and I mean, Arnie, you know more than I do about Oregon forestry, but it's more results oriented. Like you have to, you know, have clean water through certain practices, but you don't have to prove it up front. It's already a given that if you do this, you're going to have clean water. Where California, you have to almost reinvent the wheel every single time. It's just, and it's because of CEQA. They don't have CEQA.
The short answer is that California is hung up on process,
Yeah.
and Oregon is hung up on results.
Because their water quality is the same. They still manage water, spotted owls. Their clear cuts can go up to 120 acres, ours are restricted to 20 acres. There's a lot of reasons why they have larger clear cuts. Clear cutting in and of itself is not a bad thing. I mean, I always advocate it because from a watershed standpoint, it's kind of like mimicking a large fire. You go in and replant it, and then you walk away for 50 years. Versus if you're selectively logging, you're in there every 5, 10 years, manipulating the forest, disturbing the wildlife, disturbing the soils, and you've got, instead of, like agriculture, it's annual impacts to the land. Forestry, it's every 5 to 10 years, unless you go to even age management, and then you just do your thing, walk away, and then come back, and then you mimic it. Were you going to say something?
I had a question for both of you. Martin, how many NSO pairs or spotted owl pairs do you have within that watershed?
Well, it's been changing over time.
But I mean, how many circles actually either exist within there or slop over? I'm just curious how many pairs you've got in there relative to what we have down here.
You'll have to, I'm going to have to say, take it with a
Just
grain of
wait,
salt.
wait.
But we've had, what I keep hearing is in the range of 6 to 10 within that.
Pairs?
Well, pairs and singles, but
Yeah.
circles.
Yeah, that's excellent.
And in fact, 11 provinces in the Pacific Northwest, the only province that the owls are basically holding their own and not declining is in Siskiyous. And the most functional population is in the Ashland watershed. So Fish and Wildlife Service should be listed as a partner on this project. They were really reticent to allow any forest management, as you might expect. I mean, spotted owl habitat. But as time went on, it became clear that large fire would remove a whole lot of spotted owl habitat too. And, so there's been a lot of regulatory back and forth. But the fact that we could move forward in the watershed with active management, including logging, fuel reduction, we've really had to work pretty hard with Fish and Wildlife and with the forest biologists.
How about Lake Siskiyou? Are there any NSO territories in the flood control district around Lake Siskiyou?
Not in the surrounding, but not within our direct watershed. We have bald eagle, osprey.
The closest is on the U.S. Forest Service. There's some LSR properties, parcels up in the Shasta community on the other side of River Road.
Yeah, there's Lake Zero, there's habitat, but we haven't had a pair. We still survey, but we haven't had an activity center. And for the reason he asked me about Lake Siskiyou is our company, we manage Lake Siskiyou. The county owns 1,600 acres around Lake Siskiyou. And if you've seen, as you go up over the dam, and you've seen the thinning over like the Box Canyon, or you go up and there's the new parking lot and the thinning along the trail, that's some of the work we've done. And then we manage pretty much all the way around the lake. So, yeah.
Being interested in both of your perspectives on kind of the avoiding or dealing with the conflict of interest between a lot of the stuff that we can all agree on about density reduction, the need for that. But a lot of that density reduction can be accomplished with removing smaller trees, not the largest trees.
Mm-hmm.
But from a commercial perspective, obviously, the larger trees can be more valuable. And I think there has been a lot of public distrust because of a track record of, private companies employing a certain rhetoric and then actually having a different economic interest. So I'm just interested in how you kind of work on balancing that.
Well, in California, as far as thinning out your trees, I advocate that on a lot of small landowners, the county. I mean, I would never recommend for them to do even age or more industrial harvesting because contrary to public opinion, clear cutting is very expensive. It's not always the most economical way to harvest because you have to put in anywhere from $500 to $1,000 an acre to get it regrowing that you're not going to see again in this state for 80 to 120 years. We have a lot different time frames when you can get back in harvest than Oregon because of our forest practice rules. We have adjacency rules. So the reason though that timber companies don't always thin, if this is what you're getting at, and why they do go after the biggest trees or